Hello, everyone. I was listening to LBC last night, early hours of the morning, um, and the main theme that was being covered was, of course, the murder of David Amess MP. And a big part of that conversation was it was Clive Bull, incidentally, the presenter. A big part of the conversation was about the tone and rhetoric and how things have got so toxic in terms of discourse. And the subject of social media kept coming up. I called in. It was like I was on the waiting queue, and it's one of those cases of you might get through, you might not. So you sort of the way it works if you've never called into a radio station before, you give the basic gist of what you're going to say, and then they'll either keep you on hold or call you back. And they did say, to be fair, that they couldn't guarantee it, so I didn't get through. But my take on it was that there's all this focus on social media, but there's other factors as well. In the last decade, we've had, well, actually three referendums, but two of those were particularly toxic and divisive. I'm talking about the Scotland referendum and the European Union referendum, Brexit. I was going to say the Brexit referendum, but technically it was the EU referendum, EU membership referendum. But both of those campaigns, the Scotland one perhaps a bit more localised to Scotland. I was in Edinburgh on referendum day. I wouldn't say it was a violent atmosphere, but it was an atmosphere, and there was some, I got some personal abuse because I was on the unionist side, and it just that was a factor. It was there. With the Brexit thing, much more so because it's prolonged. With Scotland, yeah, that's an issue in Scotland and it still rumbles on. But what I took from those experiences, seeing those referendums like everyone else, is that they're fundamentally divisive. Referendums, I think, on one hand, I suppose it's direct democracy, putting it up to the people. But on the other hand, if you have a close result, or even if it's not that close, but it's like, if the minority is still sizable, then you're going to have a situation where families are going to be divided, neighbors, friends are going to be divided. I think it's a very toxic thing. I'm not saying there should never be referendums, but I do think that no one can rationally say that Brexit hasn't been divisive. Um, and that was 5 years ago, and we're out. We're out of the EU, but I think the atmosphere is still here. And Brexiteers would be tempted to say, "Oh, that's because Remainers want another referendum." Well, most people who vote Remain are not calling for another referendum. But I would insist that we still have freedom of expression in this country, and if people see things not going the way they were promised to, or if they feel that something is a consequence of Brexit, you could dispute that. You could say that's got no link to Brexit because this is also happening in mainland Europe, and that's a valid argument. But there is this sort of this is another thing I dislike about referendums: the idea that the winning side are the only side allowed an opinion. Now, to take Scotland for example, I feel stronger on that than I did on Brexit. I voted Remain, but it wasn't like dogmatically so. On Scotland, I believe in the United Kingdom, and that is, something I feel strongly about. But I don't say that Scottish nationalists are forbidden to have an opinion. I don't say that they can't feel that the UK should be broken up. I strongly disagree with them, strongly. And I think they should respect democracy and respect the results of the 2014 referendum. But, I would never say that they can't have conviction, they can't believe that an independent Scotland's better. I just think they're wrong. But this is really the thing about democracy, isn't it? That we have to always question our own values, or rather ask if we're upholding those. So getting back to what happened yesterday, you know, um, there's all these questions about atmosphere and tone. And inevitably, a lot of this is coming back to what Angela Rayner said at the Labour conference, her notorious scum comments. I made a video about that, you can see my take on that. But briefly summarised, my gut feeling was it was wrong of her to say that. My gut feeling at the time was she is a senior politician. You know, she's deputy leader of the Labour Party. That was inflammatory. And the fact that she had no remorse and she doubled down didn't, I don't think that went down well. Um, and of course, she was one of the first to, express her sorrow at Sir David Amess's death, perhaps conscious of the fact that she would be criticised. Now, to be fair, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that this guy that attacked Sir David Amess was motivated by Angela Rayner. In fact, some sources are suggesting I want to be careful about this because it's still uncertain at this point, but some sources have suggested he was a Somalian, 25. I know that it's being treated as a terrorist incident, so whether this was an Islamist attack, in which case it's probably got nothing to do with Angela Rayner's comments. I mean, the indication is wasn't some hard left socialist person who just hates the Tories, and so far that's not the indication. If it was, then maybe it would be easy to blame Rayner, but I think that's a little bit of I think the connection's a little bit thin. Still, the optics are not good, and it gets back to responsibility about language. Um, I mean, across the pond, it's even worse. It's even more toxic. Um, I would say that the things that Donald Trump has come out with has been a utter, it's disgraceful that the leader of the free world came out with some of the stuff that he did, and that his supporters think that's okay. Um, you see, I have this sort of thing about a balance between blunt honesty whilst also recognizing that words have weight. So I don't want to see a situation where politics and discourse becomes overly sanitized. I really don't want to see that. And one thing I didn't really like about the conversation last night was they kept emphasizing how toxic social media is, and you get these faceless trolls who send threats to people and so on. I would really emphasize that there is a difference between a threat and an insult. Now, what Angela Rayner said wasn't a threat. It was unpleasant and it was perhaps inflammatory, but it wasn't a threat. Incidentally, the same week she said that, there was a Tory MP, I forget his name, but basically joked about sending a bomb to Labour Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodds' home. Now, he apologised. It was just a joke. Again, it gets back to this question about responsibility of language. I remember a few years ago there was a UKIP councillor in Kent, Swale Council, and she came out with these absolutely disgusting comments that remain voters, not even just politicians, but voters should be hanged. Now, she doubled down, and this woman had a long history of racist outbursts. By the way, she was of Sri Lankan descent. So before people, jump to conclusions, she was actually of Sri Lankan descent. But I was totally disgusted, and I think Swale Council should have fired her on the spot. I mean that was a threat of violence. Um, there are public figures I feel very strongly about. I maintain that judges should be more accountable. But in maintaining that and in pushing that argument, I would never advocate any threat against them. I simply say that if they are consistently lenient, if they're so out of touch with the public that they are contributing to the breakdown in trust, then I think the job should be on the line. Um, so we have to be a little bit careful in a situation like this that there isn't an overreaction. I mean, attacks against MPs have happened in this country. I mentioned yesterday there's been at least 6 deaths. Some of those were attributed to the troubles in Northern Ireland, that was a unique situation. But still, it's in proportion to the number of MPs there are. That's actually a very high ratio. I mean, there's 650 MPs, so to have 2 killed in 5 years, that's actually a very high ratio. I don't know what the maths would be, but if that sort of statistic was for police officers, that would work out literally at hundreds of police officers being killed. So in that sense, it's a high ratio because some people were calling in and saying, "Oh, why does his life matter more than others?" But that isn't the point. The point is he was killed in his place of work, and everyone should have a right to be safe in their place of work. As Clive Bull said, if a supermarket attendant was stabbed in his or her, in Tesco's, that would be the debate. That would be, how is this happening in our society? So I don't think it's a case that an MP's life is worth more than, for example, a stabbing victim. But um, the point is, knife crime is already widely discussed. So I don't really agree that this is getting more attention than, or rather, it's getting more. It's seen as more important in that sense. Of course, it's newsworthy because he's an elected representative. So it is an attack on democracy in that sense. Um, I just think we have to be a little bit careful, though, not to overly sanitize things either. There has to be, and I absolutely, forcefully maintain this. There has to be scope for public anger. So, the trajectory of the conversation last night was a little bit. They were talking about civility and the need to tone things down, and I totally understand that. But I don't want things toned down to such an extent that they're sanitized. And I think sometimes when people talk about civility, I think that it can maybe push aside being candid. I mean, let me clarify this a bit more. When I think it's possible to say, well, I strongly disagree with this person's politics, and I think they're wrong to have that position, and that policy is hurting people, and to be angry about that. But for me, the line of civility would be when you start getting into threats or you start getting into really personalized ad hominem, like really, really. I don't think it's like I dislike the Tories or I dislike Labour. Freedom of expression is one of the most valuable things we have. And frankly, freedom of expression includes the right to say, I dislike someone. So I feel a little bit concerned when the civility thing comes up, that it's about overly sanitizing things, and I don't agree with that. I think that people should be able to express dislike or um, anger. You know, I mean, to me, civility shouldn't be about, or rather, this focus on civility shouldn't be about, oh, let's all just be nice to each other. I don't think that's realistic. I really don't. I mean, Sir David Amess himself had strong views, and he's forcefully made his case. He had strong views on animal welfare. I understand that he was, as a Catholic, he was strong on abortion issues. So, he had strong views. Um, and this is the great thing about democracy, the fact that we do have freedom to express those views. But the red line is when you start making threats against people, or when you start dehumanizing people in that sense, or you start to, targeted bullying of an individual. In terms of social media, I think sometimes social media is blamed a bit too much because on Facebook, for example, there is a block button, okay? And I know that in some cases for public figures that they're bombarded with abuse. So there's like maybe thousands of vitriolic comments. I don't know about Twitter, I don't use it, but I know how Facebook works. There is blocking buttons. There is, ways of phasing that out. And I'm a little bit concerned that, there will be a rush to be overly censorious. I already have concerns about Facebook. I think they're inconsistent in the way they police content. And that's something that didn't really come up last night, which is kind of, got a bit of an edge, which is kind of frustrating because I think it's an important point. That is to say, yes, these big networks have a responsibility, but at the same time, do we really want a situation where they become overly censorious? Now, I understand that there is this aspect of people sometimes say things on social media that they wouldn't necessarily say in real life, but I still think it's a little bit of hyperbole to just blame all of the toxicity on social media. The truth is, there has always been some level of partisan divide. There has always been unpleasant people. Perhaps social media has exacerbated that. But social media has also brought a lot of good things. It's helped friends and family reconnect. It has highlighted important campaigns. It's done good things as well. So I think, I mean, I've plenty of cynicism about it, but I've never totally dismissed it as entirely negative because I don't think it is. So I'm going to draw this up, but basically, in terms of the security, it might be unavoidable that there will have to be a serious security review. It may be that MPs, for example, need glass or plastic panes. I mean, that's an awful thing because if you have constituents who like their MP and the MP likes them and they want this connection, that is literally going to be a barrier. I know Nigel Farage was arguing about this on LBC that it's disgraceful that MPs don't have security, but the question is, they certainly can't fund it themselves. An MP salary is not as much as people think. It's 81,000, which is certainly a comfortable amount of money, but not enough to cover full-time security. So then it would have to be funded by Parliament, and then there'll be questions about, oh, well, they're just in it for themselves. So um, it's going to be a question of balance. Clearly, something has to be done. Clearly, I think MPs need to check their security arrangements with police. Perhaps, at the very least, perhaps there should be more vetting of meetings. For example, if someone wants to meet their MP, they should provide an address and some basic contact details, things like that. That could perhaps be a security mechanism because if they are planning something, then they might think twice. If they know that their data, their address, and so on is has been disclosed, then they might not do it. So something like that could help. But I think most MPs won't want a situation where they cannot speak to their constituents because contrary to what people think, most MPs do actually work hard and want to work with the constituents. That's the first point. Second point is they actually can't do their job without doing that. I mean, they cannot address letters and concerns and raise those issues in Parliament. They literally cannot do the job without meeting constituents. But in terms of the tone, in terms of the rhetoric, I think the words matter. I think public figures from councillors right up to ministers need to be responsible in their words about how they're talking about other politicians. But I don't want a situation to be overly sanitized either, because we have had threats to freedom of expression in this country, and people have to be able to express anger. They have to even be able to express dislike, saying, I hate the Tories. It's different if they say, I hate this individual, I'm going to target this individual. But there has to be accountability of power. And if someone is in a powerful position, they have to accept that they will be criticised. And I think most MPs do. But clearly, this, threats is crossing that line. Let me know your thoughts.